Hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome to my channel. This is the Black Audacity Life Giver. I was coming today. I'm sorry for the echoing in the background. But I want to come today and have a live chat on things that have been misrepresented on the internet, specifically in certain spaces. And I want to talk about the delusional mindset of a lot of people in reference to the Black community. Things that have hindered the Black community, and things that are literally being kept under the swept under the carpet. Nobody is really talking about them, and people are making up their own narratives to excuse the horrific behaviors of a large percentage of the folks within the community. So, I want to say first and foremost, excuse me, I have a cold. So, if I sound congested, that's the reason why. I have a really bad cold, and I may pause at times so that I can cough because I don't want to be coughing loudly into the mic. But nonetheless, let's get started. First and foremost, everybody who's here, hit the like button. Make sure that you hit that like button because your girl appreciate it, and it brings people to the page. It shows YouTube that we're enjoying the channel, and it increases the algorithm. So make sure that if you're in here, please do me a favor and hit that like button. If you can hear me, if my sound is good, put a one in the chat, because before I get started, I want to make sure that my sound clarity is good. So please put a one in the chat if you can hear me. Hold on. Okay. So today's topic is going to be about something that was discussed on the Destiny versus Angry Man's debate. The intellectual whipping that the Angry Man got from Destiny. Him and three of his Dusty Rangers came to try to attempt to double team, triple team the Destiny Man, and they all sound like a bunch of baffling idiots. And they left the debate making black men appear worse than they did when they started. So the debate was in reference just to, it was supposed to be about the red pill logic, but it turned into a debate about black women not being worthy of black men, of black men's degeneracy. So during the debate, Angry Man made a comment about how him and one of his Dusty Rangers made a comment about how wonderful the black community was prior to the insurgence of warfare. And that is something that has been, this is a talking point that has been going on for many years at this time, and it needs to cease. Like, the black community had many issues prior to warfare. It still has issues. There's, of course, this is not 100% of the community, so I don't need people jumping on here, giving their anecdotal situations. I'm stating that the black community has issues. Everybody knows that, and there has been this false narrative going around that the black community was doing so well prior to the 1960s, when black women were allowed to get on welfare, and the man in the home bill supposedly took all these black men out of the home and caused a separation within the black family. And that's just not the case. The truth of the matter is that there was a horrific substance abuse problem going on within the black community prior to the welfare bill coming into the black community. Again, for those that are coming in, I'm gonna let everybody know that I have a horrific cold. I have really bad cold, so I'm really congested. So if I sound congested, that is the reason why. Please hit the like button as you're coming in. To today's topic and discussion is going to be about heroin and the black community in the 1960s, and the effect that it had on the black community prior to the so-called welfare taking black men out of the home. They were already leaving in droves prior to that, and heroin was destroying the black community at that time in the 1960s. So I want to share my screen. Everybody hit the like button if you're in here. Please hit the like button. I want to share my screen because we're going to go over a documentary that discusses how heroin was like ravaging the black community. First, I want to show the point of the debate when Angry Man made the assumption that the black community was doing so well prior to welfare. And then we're going to get into the actual people who were around during that time so we can see that it wasn't. Okay, so make sure you're hitting that like button. It helps it. Your girl very much appreciates it, and it brings the algorithm to the channel. So I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna just show a very small moment when Angry Man makes his delusional statement that the black community was, it's doing so well prior to welfare. And then we're gonna watch the documentary. And I'm gonna comment. I'm gonna give my commentary during the documentary. This is fair use. Let's get started.
Number one, what you said about black women doing this in response to black men. Black women doing what they did is not in response to black men. That is a misnomer. First of all, prior to the 60s, prior to the 70s, you did not have black men doing what we're talking about right now. The everything that was done in response, the 93 crime bill, everything that was done that caused that to come about, that was not the reality for black people in the 50s and the 60s. Black people in the 50s and the 60s had one of the highest marriage rates. Yeah. Black people in the 50s and the 60s had community. Okay. It isn't until after you see the emergence of this new form of a welfare system that you begin to see the degradation of the black family.
Well, but the welfare system is a response to like single.
It's a response to poverty. It's a response to the poverty that black people as a whole were enduring.
You can't blame single moms for wanting welfare. They need help taking care of their kids. And you can't blame the 93 crime bill for issues in the black community when the black community wanted the 93 crime bill.
Okay, we're going to stop it there because I really want us to get into this documentary. So as you can see, he was sort of contradicting himself because he stated, the black community was so intact. It was so wonderful, prior during the 50s and 60s, prior to the emergence of welfare. And then because of welfare, the black community started to deteriorate, even though he said they were already stuck in poverty. So if you're in poverty, then you're not doing well. But nonetheless, I'm going to get into this documentary because it's very interesting for those of us who were not around in the 1960s. And for those of us who did not really know about the emergence of heroin in the black communities in the 1960s. This is prior to crack. This is prior to the 1980s when crack hit the scene and you had cities being ran like New Jack City. And like the movie New Jack City, the movie New Jack City was a picture of how the black community was in so many different areas because of crack. But prior to crack, in the 1960s, there was heroin. Black people, specifically black men, hardly ever mentioned that it was heroin. Not only that, there was a huge emergence of teen pregnancy within the black community. I'm going to play what, and we all know teens have been getting pregnant for years and years and years. That's not a new phenomenon, but in the 1960s, the amount of teens that were getting pregnant at preteen age and at early teen age was skyrocketing. At first, there was teen pregnancies that were like 17, 18, 19. A lot of our grandparents had their first child at that age. And during that time, they were getting married. But at the age of teen pregnancies went Down meaning it was a lot sooner than it was prior to 1960s. I'm gonna show that real
Do you find that there
and then we're gonna get into the documentary of the age of the kids that were starting to get pregnant in the 1960s, which is also why there was a huge increase in non-married families, because the girls were getting pregnant at such an early age, and you can't get married at the ages that they were getting married at. Let me let you hear it from someone who was there and alive back then. This is a 1973 special report. Well, let's listen to what this woman has to say about the rate of teen pregnancy and the age at which they were getting pregnant.
do you find that there is an incidence of young girls becoming pregnant?
Yes, we have a high rate of that too.
At about what age?
Well, I used to say age 14, but I'm thinking I'm having to back up and say age 12.
So in the 1960s, the girls, not only was there an emergence of heroin, but the girls were getting pregnant at 12 years of age. These men keep saying, it was so perfect in the 1960s, the Black family was so intact, which is not the case. And again, this is not don't come on here with your anecdotal situations. We all know that there was some intact families. I'm talking about the change that was occurring within the Black community in the 1960s that these men on YouTube love to tout about, but they never talk about the huge increase in teen pregnancy rate, and they never talk about the emergence of heroin and substance abuse issues in the 1960s. This is fair use. We're going to watch the video of heroin in the 1960s and the Black community and how it started to change things.
The machine is running like, a Swiss watch.
I'm a ball.
Again, this is fair use. This is fair use. Good morning, Sleepy B. Good morning. This is fair use. So again, this is the emergence of heroin in the Black community in the 1960s, because a lot of these men love to tout about how the Black community was so perfect in the 1960s and 50s, and it was doing so well prior to Black women getting on welfare. What they don't acknowledge is that in the 1960s, the teen pregnancy rate starting at preteens at age 12 started to skyrocket. And not only did teen pregnancy rates start to skyrocket in the 1960s, which was one of the leading causes of the huge increase in non-married mothers, because most of them were teen mothers that were getting pregnant and getting on welfare, as well as the emergence of heroin within the Black community. So let's get started. Good morning. Good morning, Jess Asher. Let's get started. This is fair use.
It was the best of times, it was the worst of times for Black America. In 1959, nearly 60% of Blacks lived in poverty. 10 years later, that figure was down to 32%. But while it was the white people fleeing the cities because of crime, decay, and industrial decline, it was Black people actually suffering from the rapid growth of crime in the late 60s. The riots across the country, from Watts to Harlem, sped up this process and left a lawless urban landscape ripe for the pickings of a new breed of criminal, the drug kingpin.
Historically, heroin had been in the Black communities way back in the early days.
We as Americans always want to be very romantic about things. This was about capitalism, and this is about a type of capitalism that many poor Blacks could not go anywhere but to.
As I talked about in Cold War Heroin Heat, The increased drug supply was a direct result of the American government's decision to protect French, Italian, and Chinese drug dealers as they flooded the streets of Black America with illegal drugs for political reasons.
So again, this is in the 1960s when the Black community was so thriving, as these men said, it was thriving, it was doing so well. There was no reason for these women to be, accepting welfare and to not be family oriented. This is during that time where these men they always look over the actual facts of what was going on, and these men, it's so funny because none of these men are born during that time, and they don't actually look at documentaries of what was really going on during those times, and they just make up a bunch of delusional statements that are not factual at all, and they ignore what actually was happening during that time. So this is the 1960s with the emergence of heroin within the Black community.
61, 62, when it started getting real popular. And then around 1964, 65, it was really growing. It was booming,
In Harlem, which was ground zero of the heroin epidemic thanks to the Italian mafia, a shocking 20%, 1 in 5 of Black men were injecting heroin with needles on a daily basis circa 1970.
1964, 1 in 5 Black men was injecting heroin. These are the intact families that they was talking about in 1964.
3 of the biggest drug kingpins in the United States at that time were Black: Frank Lucas, Leslie Ike Atkinson, and Frank Pee Wee Matthews. Extremely intelligent. They were not given the education opportunities that the whites had.
It was a poor community. We lived in poor housing. From that poor housing, we went to poor schools, received a poor education, and that poor education sent us on poor paying jobs. It returned us right back into the poor community.
Paid you, $1.55 an hour. Here, the only job you're gonna get, wash these dishes. A lot of disrespect. And I wasn't having that. And the only other way I knew to earn that type of money was in narcotics.
With Vietnam.
So you had the Black men. Now, Vietnam War was from 1955 to 1975. He's going to mention Vietnam War. But you had the Black men who could barely find jobs. He said that they were making about $1.55 an hour. And they were in dilapidated communities with the women and the children. A lot of times they were stating that they couldn't even find jobs except during the summertime for construction. You had a huge uptick in preteen pregnancies starting at age 12. These girls were not married. They were getting pregnant, and of course, at 12 years old, you're not going to be married. So a lot of these men and their mammy rangers who forget to discuss what was really going on in the 1960s, which was a huge uptick in teen pregnancies and heroin use and poverty, which is what also led to the uptick in unmarried families within the Black community. If you got 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds getting pregnant at alarming rates, you have poverty, you have heroin addicts. 1 in 5 Black men is a heroin addict in the 1960s. You're not going to have intact married families.
And the introduction of LSD and the return of the soldiers from Vietnam, the drug scene kind of proliferated.
New York City was ground zero. 1 out of 5 men in Harlem were injecting heroin on a daily basis, and a rogues gallery of Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Black dealers fed the streets with the heroin and cocaine they got from their Italian suppliers, or increasingly that they got themselves directly. New connects, new sources of supply were appearing every day as the drug business had become an important part of the American economy.
The interesting thing is I toured the nation. I saw those same types of men in many cities, whether it was.
So we just saw the men that was getting out of the vehicles. These are the so-called wealthy men in the Black community. And what are they doing? They're helping with the distribution and flooding of heroin within their own communities. Some people will say nobody can blame them, but yes, you can blame you for poisoning your own community.
Philadelphia or Baltimore or Washington, D.C., they were the ones that would go to the little private parties after a concert. And those men were an elite group.
There's an old saying in the streets, there's no business like blow business. In 1970, $500 of Turkish morphine base turned into a $5,000 kilo of heroin in Marseille, France, which turned into a $20,000 kilo in New York, which could turn into as much as $1 million by the time it went into a junkie's veins. The poppy plant is the mother of the world's highest profit margin commodity.
This is right before Watergate. The president called all of us down to the White House for a meeting on his drug abuse plan. He was livid with rage when I told him what was going on in Brooklyn, and but the violence in Brooklyn at the time, murders. Miami, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Atlanta, similar information was coming back.
You heard them say the violence, the drug use, the unaliving, and this is in the 1960s, because these men with their misinformation and their delusional mindsets keep saying that none of this was going on in the 1950s and 60s. This didn't happen until the women of the that were in the welfare and single mothers raised their children in the 70s and 80s. That's when they say the crime started to happen, because these are supposed to be children of that were born in the 70s and 80s that were committing all these crimes. This is in the 1960s. These men look upward of 30 to 40 years of age. So we know they were born in either the 30s or the 20s, and they were committing these crimes. These was men that came from so-called intact families with a father in the home.
Some guy named Matthews was behind the local organizations in those cities, that he was tired of paying huge amounts of money to the La Cosa Nostra, and a group of Jewish businessmen in Brooklyn were distributing heroin.
You know, later I went to the hard narcotics smuggling section of customs. That's when I started getting a little bit of an education and understanding that all the heroin was coming from Italian sources, Jewish too.
In 1959, the criminal landscape of America changed drastically after mob boss Vito Genovese was sent to prison for heroin conspiracy. The mafia decided to get out of heroin, which really meant they would simply import the drug with the help of their CIA connections in Europe and let non-family members like the Jewish Herbie Sperling middleman the drug to Black and Latino dealers. The biggest middleman of all was Lou Cirillo, the mafia's point man when they decided to get back in the business around 1970. Before Frank Matthews got his own Corsican source, Lou Cirillo.
So he said they wanted to middleman the drugs to Black and Latino men, because they knew that Black and Latino men would flood these drugs into their own communities. They weren't trying to sell these drugs to their people. They wanted to sell them to Black and Latinos. And the men of those communities were all for helping them do so.
Cirillo supplied them, along with most of New York's biggest dealers. Something went wrong for the mafia in 1972, though, something big. So big that the boss of the Lucchese family, Tommy Ryan Eboli, was executed in Crown Heights, Brooklyn on the orders of the Mafia Commission.
The basic issue for us is self-determination. It's to be able to live in America with some degree of dignity. It's to have some control over our own destiny. We don't want welfare, colonialism in the Black ghetto. We don't want white business to come in and say, well, we're going to do you a favor today. We're going to give you 300 jobs. The basic issue has to do with whether or not we can control some employment for ourselves. And that means we've got to have some kind of selective patronage. We've got to control businesses in Black communities.
So the mafia heroin business was in disarray and the French Connection was over. In this power vacuum, kingpins like Frank Matthews and Eddie Jackson became some of the richest Black men in America almost overnight. Here's an interesting fact. When Norris Herndon, heir to the Atlanta Life Insurance Company and reputedly the richest black man in America, died in 1977, he was worth $23 million. I know for a fact that dealers like Nicky Barnes in New York and Eddie Jackson in Detroit were profiting up to $1 million a month at that time.
And Frank Matthews at that time, I think, was probably under 30 years old, was extremely bright, had good leadership skills, and had convened a meeting of all the top African-American and Hispanic drug dealers in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1971. And his goal was to unite and form a family where they cut out the Italian mafia and went right to the source of heroin and brought it in and controlled the distribution.
So you got a 30-year-old man in 1971, which means he was born in 1941. Supposedly during the time when black families were intact, the fathers were in the home and they were raising these children that were supposed to be successful, supposed to be, you know, have morals and values, and that were supposed to be pillars of their community, but yet they are drug dealers and pushing upwards of $1 million a week or a month into their own community back in the 1960s and early 1970s. Again, this is not the crack epidemic. This is heroin and LSD.
He put $4 million on the table at one time. And he bragged about this. And he says, let me see if you can match this. And nobody could at the time. And he bought heroin or cocaine.
Detective Garay's story here seems to dovetail in with a story from a federal informant. In early 1971, the informant said he went to a brownstone in Brooklyn to chip in on a heroin purchase that Elwood Bynum and Frank Matthews were organizing with their Corsican partners in France.
And it needs to be noted that these black men
streets was in the works. Believe it or not, the heroin was smuggled across the Atlantic from France to New York using underwater mines, once used by the Nazis.
Sorry, for some reason, StreamYard had kicked me off. I'm back.
To protect the coastline from Allied invasion in World War II.
Yeah, giving $1 million to a friend to hold. And disappeared again. So when the gentleman sees him again, he say, Frank, when you gonna come get that money? And Frank goes, what money? He said, yo, man, you remember you gave me the shopping bag, those shopping bags, that money? He said, I'll come get it in a week or so. So how much money does he have?
We interviewed some informants. We rushed through an indictment, the first indictment before the superseding indictments, and we had Matthews indicted.
Mr. Brown, we're wondering why you haven't sued or taken some other action. I think if...
So we all know with drugs, selling and distribution of drugs and buying of drugs, there's going to be an informant eventually. That's rocket science. That's not rocket science. I'm sorry. There's always going to be an informant, and generally the informants come from within the community and are relatives or friends of the men who are the drug dealers. But these people keep saying that they were coerced to sell drugs. Then they were thrown in prison. Yeah, you were thrown in prison because you were destroying your communities. You were bringing drugs as well as crime to your communities, as well as unaliving people, and you deserved to have been sent to prison. You were wreaking havoc all over your communities.
These stories had been written about me, I would be denying them to the nth degree.
Well, we denied it already, and like I said, we got to let our lawyer handle it in the legal matter through the courts.
Courtney Brown Sr. didn't get involved in selling drugs until he was 30 years old. He was actually a steward for the Detroit City Bus Workers Union, which was probably the ceiling of achievement for most black males in America circa 1970, unless you got in the drug business.
So he had a good job for what would be considered a good job for a black man. He was a county bus driver, and he decided, that wasn't good enough. He wanted to make money selling drugs to the folks within his community.
He knew we're driving the bus and playing the union game where that was going to lead. And it would have eventually led to a nice house, maybe one day on the northwest side of Detroit, and a decent pension. The kind of money that Eddie was already making, it became obvious that if he got involved with him, he was going to have an opportunity to set himself up and put his family in a whole different situation than very few will ever get to know.
Okay, that's the end of the documentary, but I just wanted to show this documentary because it's really getting past annoying for black men to keep coming up with all these delusions and these lies that they have no idea why the black community started to deteriorate during the 1960s and 70s, when they are fully aware, if they actually do the research, as to what was going on. There was an increase in men just up and leaving the families. There was a huge increase in teen pregnancy rate, and there was an increase in substance abuse in the 1960s. So those things need to be talked about more. I wish that more content creators would actually bring that to light, that during the 1960s, not only was there welfare, but there was 12-year-olds being impregnated at alarming rates, 12, 13, and 14-year-olds that were unmarried, which of course is going to increase the amount of non-married mothers, as well as there was heroin being distributed, and there was poverty at an alarming rate, and black men were just not being leaders because they weren't used to being leaders. They hadn't been leaders since we touched soul over here. So the majority of them were used to being under the constriction of ownership, or not really being used to actually being the head of a family. So that whole mindset continued from slavery until the release of slaves, and it is a continued mindset even today. So stop with the delusional lies that black men are being just railroaded and lied on, when everybody can see what is really going on. I'm going to share the link. If anybody feels like they have something to say or they want to add to this, feel free to come up. Make sure everybody that's in here is hitting the like button. If you just got here, you pretty much missed the documentary that I shared in reference to the horrific heroin epidemic that was going on in the 1960s within the black community. You can just catch the replay so that you can see that. So I'm really sick. I'm really congested. So it's sort of hard for me to talk because I want to cough really bad. But please, everybody, hit the like button. If nobody wants to come up or has anything to share, I'm going to get going. Thank you all for coming. Make sure you hit the like button before you leave out. I appreciate it. Show your girl that type of love. And until next time, thanks.